Tonight, we travel back in time to uncover the story of a world where marble columns reached toward azure skies, where philosophy was born in shadowed colonnades, and where beneath the surface of civilization's grandest achievements lay complexities we rarely discuss. Before we begin, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Settle in. Get comfortable. What I'm about to share with you isn't the sanitized history we learned in school textbooks. This is the story of those who lived at the margins, whose experiences shaped ancient Greek society in ways that historians have only recently begun to fully acknowledge. This is about survival, about power, about the human body as commodity, and about lives lived in service to desires that were never their own. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era. The Parthenon gleams white against the sky. The Agora bustles with merchants and philosophers. Democracy is being born. Art and literature flourish. But walk down certain streets as twilight falls, and you'll find another Athens entirely. One where young bodies are bought and sold, where foreign boys stand in doorways, their eyes downcast, where the price of survival is measured in obols and the currency is flesh. This is the world we're entering tonight. Not to sensationalize, not to judge by modern standards, but to understand. To bear witness to lives that were lived, to suffering that was real, to a system that was as much a part of ancient Greece as the symposia and the Olympic Games. The story begins not with philosophy or glory, but with a simple, brutal truth. In ancient Greece, your body could be property, your consent could be irrelevant, and if you were young, male, and unlucky enough to be enslaved or desperate enough to sell yourself, you might find yourself in a role that would shape every moment of your remaining days. Understanding the terminology. Before we go further into this history, we need to understand the words the ancient Greeks used, because language reveals how a society thinks, what it values, and what it chooses to hide in plain sight. The Greeks had many words for those who provided sexual services. For women, there was the pawn, the common prostitute who worked in brothels. There was the hetera, the educated courtesan who commanded higher prices and more respect. There was the palek, the concubine who lived with a man in a more permanent arrangement. But for males, the terminology becomes more complex, more nuanced, and often more cutting. A pornos was a male prostitute, the direct masculine equivalent of pawn. The word comes from the verb panemi, meaning to sell. A pornos was someone who sold his body, and in a culture that prized masculine dominance and penetrative power, to be the one penetrated for money was to occupy one of the lowest social positions imaginable. The Greeks didn't think about sexuality the way we do today. They didn't have words that translate cleanly to our concepts of homosexual or heterosexual. Instead, they thought in terms of active and passive, penetrator and penetrated, dominant and submissive. The gender of your sexual partner mattered far less than the role you played in the sexual act itself. For a free male citizen to desire another male wasn't shameful in itself. What was shameful was to be the receptive partner, to be penetrated, to take what they considered the woman's role, and to do so for money. That was to compound the shame exponentially. When the Greeks used the word pornos, it wasn't neutral. It carried weight, stigma, disgust. It marked a man not just as someone who sold sex, but as someone who had fundamentally compromised his masculinity, his citizenship potential, his very humanity in Greek eyes. Then there was the term paidika, a neuter plural that meant things having to do with children or boys, but was used to refer to younger male sexual partners. An eromenos, the beloved in the idealized pederastic relationship, might be called paidika, but so might a boy prostitute. The same word could encompass both an aristocratic youth in a mentoring relationship and a slave boy in a brothel. The word hetairos existed as the male equivalent of hetaira, meaning companion, but it was rarely used in explicitly sexual contexts. When ancient sources mention male companions, they're often euphemistic, dancing around the reality of what these arrangements actually entailed. For those males who lived more permanently with a patron, who weren't just hired for a night but kept for longer periods, the Greeks might use the word concubinus, borrowed later by the Romans, or they might simply refer to them as oikotai, household slaves with special duties that everyone understood but few explicitly named. The terminology matters because it reveals the mental gymnastics ancient Greeks performed to maintain their social hierarchies while engaging in practices that threatened to undermine them. They could idealize pederastic mentorship between citizen and youth while condemning male prostitution. They could visit brothels full of enslaved boys while maintaining that true Greek masculinity was inviolable. They could keep young male concubines in their homes while publicly decrying sexual passivity. Language created the framework that allowed these contradictions to coexist. By having different terms for different types of male-male sexual activity, by drawing careful distinctions between the erasts who pursued and the eromenos who submitted with appropriate reluctance, by separating the philosophical ideal from the commercial reality, the Greeks could engage in practices that might otherwise threaten their entire social order. But beneath all these careful distinctions, beneath all this terminology, there were real people. Young males, often enslaved, often foreign-born, whose bodies were used and whose experiences were shaped by these linguistic categories they had no role in creating. When we talk about male concubines in ancient Greece, we're talking about individuals who might have been called by any of these terms depending on context, on who was speaking, on what was being hidden or revealed. They might be pornoi in the brothels of Piraeus, paidika in symposium entertainment, or simply unnamed slaves in private households whose sexual duties were understood but unspoken. The variety of terms also reveals the variety of arrangements. Some males sold sexual services on the streets for a few obols a night, taking any customer who could pay. Others worked in established brothels, owned by pornoboskoi who took most of their earnings. Still others were purchased as slaves specifically for sexual purposes and lived in households where they might serve one master for years or even decades. And then there were those who occupied an ambiguous middle ground. Perhaps they had been educated and trained as entertainers, musicians, dancers. Perhaps they had been beautiful enough that their owners saw more profit in keeping them as personal companions than in sending them to work the fields or mines. Perhaps they had formed genuine attachments to their owners, complicated relationships that blurred the lines between coercion and consent, between slavery and something that might almost resemble partnership. The Greek language had words for all these situations, but it didn't have words for what these individuals felt, for the psychological weight of living as sexual property, for the slow erosion of self that came from years of being used by others. Understanding this terminology is essential because when we read ancient sources, we need to decode what's being said and what's being carefully not said. When a Greek writer mentions a beautiful boy at a symposium, when a philosopher discusses the proper conduct of eromenoi, when a comic playwright makes jokes about rent boys and their clients, they're using language that reveals the sexual economy of ancient Greece, while simultaneously obscuring the human cost of that economy. The words tell us that this world existed, that it was common, that it was integrated into daily life. But the words also create distance, turning real people into categories, lived experiences into abstract discussions of propriety and shame. So, the social context of male-male relations. To understand what life was like for male concubines in ancient Greece, we first need to understand the broader context of male-male sexual relations in Greek society. Because these relationships didn't exist in a vacuum. They were part of a complex social system with its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own internal logic that seems alien to us today. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens during the classical period, male-male sexual relationships were not only accepted but, in certain forms, actively encouraged. But this acceptance came with very specific conditions, very particular expectations, and severe consequences for those who violated the unwritten rules. The idealized form of male-male relationship was pederasty, a word that makes modern readers uncomfortable, and rightly so. But we need to understand what the Greeks meant by it, because their conception was very different from what that word conjures in our contemporary minds. Pederasty, in the Greek context, referred to a relationship between an older male, the erastes or lover, typically in his 20s or early 30s, and a younger male, the eromenos or beloved, typically in his mid to late teens. This wasn't child abuse in the Greek understanding, though it absolutely involved what we would today recognize as minors. The eromenos was supposed to be past puberty but not yet fully grown into manhood, his beard just beginning to appear, his body still smooth and adolescent. The ideal pederastic relationship, as described in philosophical texts and depicted in art, was highly regulated by social norms. The erastes was expected to pursue his beloved with gifts, with attention, with demonstrations of his worth. The eromenos was expected to be aloof, neither too eager nor too resistant. He wasn't supposed to experience sexual pleasure from the relationship. That would have been shameful, marking him as pathikos, someone who enjoyed being penetrated. Instead, the eromenos was supposed to submit, if he submitted at all, out of respect for his erasts, out of gratitude for the mentorship and gifts he received, out of a kind of charis or grace that acknowledged the older man's devotion without descending to mere sexual transaction. When sexual activity occurred in these relationships, and ancient sources debate how often and what kind, it was ideally supposed to be intercrural, between the thighs, not anal. Penetration, especially anal penetration, was considered degrading to the eromenos. It turned him into something too much like a woman, something too much like a slave. It threatened his future ability to take his place among adult male citizens as an erastes in his own right. This idealized pederasty was largely an aristocratic institution. It flourished among the upper classes who had the leisure for symposia, for athletics, for the gymnasium where beautiful youths exercised naked and older men could observe and court them. It was connected to military training, to philosophical education, to the transmission of culture from one generation of elite males to the next. But this ideal was always just that, an ideal, a cultural fiction that coexisted with much messier realities, because alongside this carefully regulated aristocratic pederasty, there existed a vast sexual economy where none of these careful rules applied, where young males were bought and sold, where penetration was the point, where consent was irrelevant, where the only thing that mattered was payment and the satisfaction of the customer. The contradiction was glaring but apparently sustainable. The same men who might court an aristocratic youth with elaborate ceremony might visit a brothel the same night and pay a few aboles to use an enslaved boy. The same philosophers who wrote about the nobility of pederastic love owned slaves who served their sexual needs. The same society that developed elaborate etiquette around proper male-male courtship also had thriving prostitution districts where those courtship rules simply didn't apply. How did Greeks reconcile this contradiction? Through that fundamental division between active and passive, free and enslaved, citizen and foreigner. The crucial factor wasn't the gender of your sexual partner. It was your role in the sexual act and your social status. A free male citizen could penetrate anyone younger, lower in status, female, enslaved, foreign, without threat to his masculinity. His dominance was reinforced by the act of penetration. He remained masculine, powerful, in control. But to be penetrated, especially as an adult, especially for money, especially by multiple partners, was to occupy a position incompatible with citizenship, with masculinity, with humanity as the Greeks understood it. Male prostitutes and concubines existed outside the realm of idealized pederasty. They were foreign to it, degraded by comparison to it, examples of what happened when sexual relations between males were stripped of all the philosophical and educational framework that supposedly justified and ennobled them. Where pederasty was supposed to be about mentorship and the transmission of virtue, prostitution was purely transactional. Where the eromenos was supposed to give himself reluctantly and with dignity, the pornos was bought and used. Where pederastic relationships were supposed to end when the beloved reached manhood and took his place among citizens, male prostitutes and concubines could be used until they were deemed too old, too worn, too unattractive to command a price. The social context also included religious dimensions. Various gods and mythological figures were associated with same-sex relationships. Zeus and Ganymede, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Hercules and Hylas. These myths depicted divine love for beautiful youths. The gods themselves engaged in behaviors that mirrored aristocratic pederasty, which gave those relationships divine sanction in the Greek imagination. But there were no myths about divine male prostitutes, no gods who honored the pornos. The religious framework that elevated certain forms of male-male desire had no place for those who sold their bodies for survival. Public space in Greek cities was divided in ways that reflected these sexual hierarchies. The gymnasium and palaestra, where citizen youths trained and were courted by older men, were respectable spaces. The symposium, where aristocratic men reclined together, drank wine and might be entertained by beautiful boys, was private but not shameful. But the poneia, the brothels, were concentrated in specific districts like the Keramikos in Athens, areas everyone knew about but that respectable citizens passed through quickly. The spaces where male prostitutes worked were marked as degraded, as separate from the civic life that defined Greek identity. Laws reinforced these distinctions. In Athens, there were laws regulating prostitution, but they were less about criminalizing it than about maintaining social boundaries. Male citizens who had prostituted themselves were barred from certain civic functions. They couldn't speak in the assembly, couldn't become magistrates, couldn't perform in certain religious ceremonies. The act of selling one's body for sexual use permanently degraded a citizen's status. For those who weren't citizens, who were slaves or foreigners, these laws didn't apply because they already lacked those civic rights. But the stigma remained. To be known as a pornos, even if you were enslaved and had no choice, was to be marked as fundamentally degraded. The social context was one of profound hypocrisy, where the same acts could be either idealized or despised depending on context. where the same men who cultivated refined aesthetic appreciation for male beauty could treat male prostitutes as disposable objects, where a society that gave us Plato's Symposium with its elevated discussions of love also gave us brothels where enslaved boys serviced dozens of men a night. This was the world male concubines navigated. These were the contradictions they embodied, and understanding this context is essential to understanding their lives, because their experiences existed in the gap between ideal and reality, between philosophy and commerce, between the Erastes courting his beloved with gifts and the customer paying for a quick transaction in a rented room. Shucked pathways into sexual labour. How did someone become a male concubine or prostitute in ancient Greece? The answer is rarely simple and almost never voluntary in any meaningful sense. The pathways into sexual labour were varied, but they shared common elements of coercion, desperation, and loss of freedom or choice. The most common route was through enslavement. The majority of male prostitutes and concubines in ancient Greece were slaves, douloi, legally owned by another person. And how did one become a slave in the first place? War was perhaps the primary source. When Greek city-states conquered others, when they besieged and captured cities, the male inhabitants faced grim choices. Adult men might be executed, but youths, those in their teens, those still young enough to be valuable, they might be enslaved. Beautiful boys were particularly prized. They would be examined at the market, their teeth checked like horses, their bodies scrutinized for defects or appeal. Some would be purchased for agricultural labour or mining. Others, if they were attractive enough, if they were deemed suitable, might be bought specifically for sexual purposes. Perhaps by a pornoboscos, a pimp who ran a brothel and would put them to work immediately. Perhaps by a wealthy citizen who wanted a household slave for personal use. Imagine being that youth. One day you're a free person in your city, perhaps training for citizenship yourself. The next, your city has fallen. You watch your father killed. Your mother and sisters are enslaved and marched off separately. You're stripped naked and chained with other youths. You're force-marched to a slave market in a foreign city where you don't speak the language. You stand on an auction block while men examine you. They touch your body invasively, checking your muscle tone, your skin, looking for scars or deformities. They lift your chin to see your face. They make you turn around slowly. You understand from their gestures and expressions what they're evaluating, what they're imagining using you for. And then you're sold. Maybe to a brothel, maybe to a private household. Your name is changed or simply not used. You're given a collar or a brand marking you as property, and your new life begins. Piracy and kidnapping provided another source. The Mediterranean was not always safe for travel. Pirates raided coastal settlements and ships, looking for valuable cargo, and humans were extremely valuable cargo. Beautiful children and adolescents could be kidnapped from islands or coastal towns, and sold far from home where no one would recognize them or come looking. These victims often came from respectable families. They might have been citizens or children of citizens in their home cities. But once kidnapped and sold into slavery far away, their former status meant nothing. They became whatever their purchasers wanted them to be. Some entered sexual labour through debt slavery, though this was less common for males than females. If a family couldn't pay debts, they might sell children into slavery. This was technically temporary, a period of servitude to work off the debt, but in practice, it could become permanent. A boy sold to cover his family's debts might find himself in a brothel, And once there, once his virginity was gone, once he'd been used by dozens or hundreds of men, what path to freedom remained? Birth into slavery was another pathway. Children born to enslaved mothers inherited their mother's status. If that mother was a prostitute, her son might be raised in the brothel, trained from childhood in the work he'd be expected to do. These individuals had never known freedom. They had no memory of another life. They were shaped from infancy by the knowledge that their body was property, that their purpose was to serve others sexually. And then there were those, far fewer but still present, who entered sexual labour through their own choice, if choice is even the right word when the alternatives are starvation or some other form of death. Free males who had become destitute, who had lost everything, who had no family or support, might turn to prostitution as a means of survival. This was deeply shameful in Greek society. A free citizen who prostituted himself lost civic rights permanently. He couldn't speak in assembly or hold office. He was marked for life as someone who had sold the one thing no citizen should sell: his body. These free prostitutes occupied an ambiguous and despised position. They weren't slaves, so they couldn't be bought and sold. But they weren't respected as free men either. They lingered in a twilight zone between statuses, degraded but not owned, free in name but bound by shame and economic desperation to continue the work that had destroyed their social standing. Some males entered sexual labour through coercion within slavery. They might have been purchased for other purposes originally, household labour or agricultural work, but their owner recognised their beauty or youth and decided to use them sexually or rent them out to others. The slave had no say in this. They might have imagined one life and been forced into another. Consider the psychological impact of these various pathways. If you were enslaved through war, you carried the trauma of conquest, of watching your city fall, of losing everyone you'd known. If you were kidnapped, you lived with the constant knowledge that somewhere people might be looking for you, grieving for you, but you'd never see them again. If you were born into this life, you had no framework for imagining anything different, and for those who chose it, even in desperation, the shame was internalized in ways that enslaved individuals could at least externalize, could at least say, "I had no choice." But the free man who became a pornos had to live with the knowledge that he'd crossed a line that free men shouldn't cross, that he'd degraded himself in a way that couldn't be undone. The pathways into sexual labour were varied, but they shared certain commonalities. They involved loss of freedom, of family, of former identity, of control over one's own body. They involved a form of social death, being cut off from the norms and protections that governed life for citizens. They involved becoming defined by one's sexual availability rather than by any other quality or capability. Most importantly, they involved an almost total lack of agency. Even those who technically chose prostitution did so under conditions of such extreme duress that calling it a choice seems cruel. The vast majority was simply forced, either through outright slavery or through circumstances that left no real alternatives. This lack of agency at the beginning of their sexual labour would characterize every aspect of their lives going forward. Because once you entered this world, whether as a prostitute in a brothel or as a concubine in a household, your body ceased to belong to you in any meaningful way. You became an instrument of others' pleasure, a commodity to be used, a thing rather than a person. And that fundamental transformation from subject to object, from person to property, is where the real horror of their existence began. The different roles, concubine versus prostitute. Not all males in sexual slavery in ancient Greece occupied the same position. There were hierarchies within degradation, variations in experience, differences in daily life that depended on whether you were a common prostitute or a personal concubine. Both roles were fundamentally about sexual availability, but the specific conditions, expectations, and experiences could vary significantly. The common male prostitute, the pornos who worked in brothels or on streets, faced the most brutal and degrading conditions. These individuals, almost always enslaved, worked in establishments owned by pornoboskoi, pimps who ran the business and took most of the profits. Brothels in ancient Athens and other Greek cities were often concentrated in specific districts. In Athens, the Keramikos district was known for its brothels. The port of Piraeus had its own red light areas where sailors and merchants could purchase sexual services. These weren't hidden establishments. They were open, legal businesses, regulated by the city and taxed like any other commercial enterprise. The porneia, the brothel itself, might be a simple structure, a series of small rooms opening onto a courtyard or corridor. The rooms were tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed or mat. Privacy was minimal. Walls were thin. You could hear what was happening in adjacent rooms and they could hear you. A typical day for a male prostitute in such an establishment began early. They might be woken by their owner or an overseer and given basic food, usually something cheap like barley porridge. Then they would prepare themselves for customers, which meant basic hygiene and making themselves as attractive as possible. Appearance mattered enormously in this work. Youth and beauty commanded higher prices. A young pornos might be able to charge 2 or 3 aboles per customer, while an older one might only get 1 abole, or even a fraction of an abole. The pornoboskos set the prices and kept most of the money, perhaps giving the prostitute a small percentage or simply providing basic food and shelter as compensation. The work itself was relentless. A prostitute might service a dozen or more customers in a day, sometimes many more during busy periods like festivals or when ships came into port. Each encounter was brief, purely transactional. A customer would pay, enter the room, use the prostitute's body however he desired and leave. Then the next customer would enter. There was no pretense of pleasure on the part of the prostitute. The customer didn't expect it and wouldn't want it. The pornos was there to be used, not to enjoy being used. Any indication that the prostitute was experiencing pleasure would have violated the sexual norms that made this transaction acceptable to the customer. The pornos was supposed to be passive, receptive, an object, not a participant. The physical toll was immense. Constant anal penetration without adequate lubrication or preparation causes tears, bleeding, infections. The Greeks had some form of olive oil for lubrication, but it wasn't always used, especially by customers who didn't care about the prostitute's comfort. Pain was simply part of the work. Male prostitutes also faced other sexual demands. While anal penetration was most common, some customers wanted oral sex, which the Greeks considered even more degrading than anal. To be penetrated orally was to be completely humiliated. Oral sex was associated with the most debased forms of sexuality, and prostitutes who performed it were considered the lowest of the low. The psychological toll matched the physical. Imagine experiencing your body as something separate from yourself, something that belongs to others, something that is constantly invaded and used. Imagine having no control over who touches you, how they touch you, what they do to you. Imagine enduring this hour after hour, day after day, year after year if you survived that long. Many didn't survive long. Disease was rampant in brothels. Sexually transmitted infections spread quickly when you're serving multiple customers daily. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments for most of these diseases. A prostitute who contracted syphilis or gonorrhea might linger for years in increasing pain and deterioration, or might die relatively quickly if the infection became systemic. Violence was also common. Customers might be drunk or aggressive. Some enjoyed inflicting pain. Some had specific fetishes that involved dominance or cruelty. The prostitute had no recourse, no protection. If a customer became violent, if they injured or even killed a prostitute, the legal consequences were minimal. The prostitute was property, and while damaging another person's property carried some penalty, it wasn't treated as a serious crime. The lifestyle offered no privacy, no dignity, no sense of self beyond what the work demanded. Many prostitutes turned to alcohol or drugs when they could access them, anything to numb the constant violation, to create some distance between their consciousness and what was happening to their bodies. The life of a concubine, while still fundamentally degrading and coercive, could be somewhat different. A concubine was a slave kept by an individual owner for sexual purposes, living in that owner's household rather than in a commercial brothel. This arrangement could sometimes, not always, but sometimes, involve better material conditions. A wealthy man who purchased a beautiful youth to keep as a personal concubine might house them well, feed them adequately, even dress them in fine clothes. The concubine became a status symbol, a display of the owner's wealth and refined taste. The sexual demands might also be less overwhelming in purely quantitative terms. Instead of servicing dozens of different men daily, a concubine typically served only their owner, and perhaps a few of the owner's friends or household guests. This meant fewer physical encounters, less risk of disease, less constant violation, but it also meant no respite, no separation between work and life. The concubine lived with their owner, was constantly available, might be called upon at any time, day or night. There was no moment when they could truly relax, no space that was theirs alone, no aspect of their life that wasn't subject to their owner's control. The relationship between owner and concubine could become complex over time. Unlike the purely transactional encounters in a brothel, a concubine might spend years with the same person. Patterns would develop. The owner might have particular preferences, particular ways they liked things done. The concubine would learn these preferences, would adapt themselves to fulfill them. Sometimes genuine attachment might develop, though calling it love seems wrong when the fundamental relationship was one of ownership and coercion. But humans are complex. Even in the most degrading circumstances, psychological bonds can form. A concubine might come to anticipate their owner's needs, might take pride in satisfying them, might develop a kind of identification with their captor that helped them psychologically survive the situation. This complexity could be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, being valued by one's owner, being seen as more than just a disposable body, could make the situation more bearable. On the other hand, the psychological entanglement could be its own form of imprisonment, making it harder to maintain any sense of separate self, any inner life that wasn't defined by serving the owner. Some owners developed what they considered affection for their concubines. They might give gifts, grant small privileges, treat the concubine better than they treated other slaves. But this affection was always within the framework of ownership. The concubine was still property. They could be sold, lent to others, punished, or killed at the owner's whim. The concubine also lived more directly in the world of the household, which meant navigating complex social dynamics. If the owner had a wife, and most male citizens did, the concubine's presence created tension. The wife might resent this young male receiving her husband's attention. She might treat the concubine cruelly as a way of expressing anger she couldn't direct at her husband. Or the wife might ignore the concubine, treat them as invisible, as just another piece of household furniture. This invisibility could be its own form of degradation, a constant reminder that you didn't register as a person worthy of acknowledgement. If there were children in the household, the concubine might interact with them, might even be tasked with some childcare duties alongside sexual duties. Imagine that psychological complexity, caring for a child while also serving the child's father sexually, existing simultaneously as a nurturing figure and as a sexual object. Other household slaves might view the concubine with a mixture of pity and contempt. Pity because the sexual degradation was obvious and constant. Contempt because the concubine might be seen as having it easier in some ways, as being fed and clothed better, as having access to the master's favour. The concubine's position was also precarious in a way that other slaves' positions weren't. Their value was tied to their beauty and youth. As they aged, as their appearance changed, as they were no longer as attractive to their owner, what happened? Sometimes they might be sold, moving from the relative privilege of being a personal concubine to the brutal life of a brothel prostitute or to hard labour. Sometimes they might simply be kept on in the household but with their special status removed, reduced to ordinary domestic slavery. Sometimes, if they'd pleased their owner well enough, they might be manumitted, freed, though this was rare. But aging was inevitable, and with it came the loss of the one quality that had defined their value. For someone whose entire existence had been shaped around their sexual attractiveness, the loss of that attractiveness was existential death long before physical death. Between the brothel prostitute and the household concubine there were other variations. Some prostitutes worked independently, if they'd managed to earn or be granted their freedom. These individuals, no longer enslaved, sold their services on their own behalf. They kept more of their earnings, but also bore all the risks themselves. They had to find customers, negotiate prices, find safe places to work. Some males worked as entertainers at symposia, the drinking parties that were central to aristocratic Greek male social life. These individuals, often enslaved boys or youths, would serve wine, play music, dance, and yes, provide sexual services to the guests. The context was more refined than a brothel, the surroundings more luxurious, but the fundamental dynamic was the same. Their bodies were there for the pleasure of free male citizens. The hierarchy within sexual labour created its own cruelties. A beautiful young concubine living in a wealthy household might look down on a street prostitute, might cling to the illusion that their situation was fundamentally different, fundamentally better. But both were enslaved. Both were sexually exploited. Both lived at the mercy of others. The material differences, real as they were, couldn't change that fundamental reality. Daily life and living conditions. What was a typical day actually like for someone in sexual slavery in ancient Greece? The routines varied depending on whether you worked in a brothel or served as a household concubine, but certain elements remained constant. The loss of autonomy, the physical demands, the psychological burden of existing primarily as a sexual object. For a brothel prostitute, the day began early. Brothels were businesses, and businesses opened when customers were available. The pornoboscos, the owner and manager of the establishment, would wake the prostitutes before dawn. Sleep was rarely sufficient. Exhaustion was a constant companion. Morning might begin with a cold wash in a communal basin. Hygiene was important not for the prostitutes' comfort, but for making them more appealing to customers and reducing the spread of obvious diseases that might drive business away. The wash was quick and perfunctory. Privacy didn't exist. Breakfast, if it was provided, was minimal. A piece of barley bread, perhaps, some watered wine. The owner wasn't interested in nourishing the prostitutes well. They were interested in the minimum necessary to keep them functional. A thin prostitute, bones visible, might actually be more appealing to some customers who preferred their partners to look fragile and young. Then came preparation for the day's work. For males, this might mean removing any facial hair that had grown, maintaining that youthful pre-adult appearance that customers preferred. Depilation was painful, done with primitive razors or even plucking, but it was necessary. A beard would mark you as too old, too adult, and would reduce your value immediately. Skin would be oiled to make it smooth and appealing to touch. Any visible scars would be covered if possible. Teeth would be cleaned. Appearance was everything. The pornoboscos might inspect each prostitute, checking their presentation, perhaps adding makeup or adjusting hair to maximize appeal. The rooms where the work happened were spare and small. A narrow bed or sleeping mat, perhaps a basin for washing between customers. Little else. The walls were thin, sound carried. You would hear other prostitutes with their customers. They would hear you. There was no escaping the reality of what was happening in every room simultaneously. The first customers might arrive mid-morning, perhaps labourers who'd finished early work and had a few obols to spend. Perhaps older men who visited brothels as part of their daily routine. The pornoboscos would quote prices, collect payment, direct customers to available prostitutes. The interaction itself was brief and utterly without pretense. The customer would enter the room. The prostitute would prepare themselves, perhaps applying more oil for lubrication, if the customer allowed time for that. Then the act itself, usually quick, often rough. The customer was paying for the use of a body and they used it as they pleased. Pain was constant. Repeated anal penetration, often without adequate preparation or lubrication, caused fissures and bleeding. There was no time to heal between customers. The next customer would arrive, and then another and another. The pain built throughout the day. Between customers, the prostitute might have a few moments, time to clean themselves minimally, to steel themselves for the next encounter. But these breaks were brief. The pornoboscos wanted to maximize profit, which meant maximizing the number of customers served. Lunch was minimal if it existed at all. Perhaps more bread, water, nothing substantial. The prostitutes weren't meant to be comfortable or well fed. They were meant to be available. Afternoons might see more traffic, especially in port cities where sailors came ashore with pay in their pockets and appetites to satisfy. These customers could be particularly rough. Sailors who'd been at sea for weeks or months, who'd been thinking about this moment, who were drunk and aggressive. The prostitute had to accommodate whatever the customer wanted. If a customer became violent, if they beat the prostitute or injured them, there was little recourse. The pornoboscos might intervene if the violence threatened to damage valuable property permanently. But short of that, the prostitute was expected to endure whatever happened. Fighting back wasn't an option. It would lead to punishment from the owner and wouldn't stop the customer anyway. As evening approached, traffic might increase further. Men coming from symposia, already drunk, looking for sexual release. groups of friends who might purchase a prostitute together, who would take turns or want the prostitute to service multiple men simultaneously. The degradation compounded. Night brought no real respite. Brothels often stayed open late, serving customers until very late at night, or even through the night during festivals or busy periods. The prostitute might finally be allowed to sleep in the early hours of morning, only to be woken a few hours later when the cycle began again. Food for the day might total a pound or so of bread, some watered wine, perhaps a small amount of fish or vegetables if the owner was less cruel, or if business was particularly good. It was subsistence, nothing more. The prostitutes were kept thin, kept weak, kept dependent. Living spaces were communal and crowded. When they weren't working, prostitutes might sleep in shared rooms, sometimes just on mats on the floor. There was no personal space, no place to retreat, no moment when they were truly alone with their own thoughts. Relationships with other prostitutes were complex. There might be solidarity born from shared suffering, but there might also be competition for the favor of customers who tipped more, for any small privilege the owner might grant. The conditions could create both compassion and cruelty among those who suffered together. Disease was a constant presence. Sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly in environments where protection didn't exist, and where prostitutes served many different partners. A prostitute who contracted gonorrhea or syphilis might continue working even as symptoms developed. The owner cared only about whether they could still function, still attract customers, still generate profit. Other illnesses were common too: poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, constant physical stress, and crowded living conditions created perfect conditions for respiratory infections, digestive problems, and parasites. A prostitute who became seriously ill might be simply abandoned. They'd used up their value. Another slave could be purchased to replace them. For household concubines, daily life followed different patterns but carried its own burdens. A concubine typically woke in the master's household, perhaps in a small room near the master's quarters, or perhaps actually in those quarters, expected to be available at any moment. Morning might involve assisting the master with dressing and preparation for the day. This wasn't purely sexual service. Concubines often performed various domestic tasks alongside their sexual duties. But the sexual availability was constant. The master might want sexual service in the morning before beginning his day. During the day, while the master was out conducting business or engaging in civic life, the concubine might have various duties, perhaps helping with household management, perhaps entertaining the master's friends if they visited, perhaps simply waiting, maintaining themselves, preparing for whenever they were called upon. The concubine ate better than brothel prostitutes, usually receiving the same food as other household slaves, which was more substantial and varied than brothel fare. They might wear better clothing, especially if the master took pride in displaying a well-dressed companion. Physical appearance remained crucial, so the master had incentive to maintain the concubine's health and appearance. But the psychological burden was different and in some ways heavier. The brothel prostitute could at least tell themselves that what happened in those brief, brutal encounters wasn't personal, that the customers were anonymous and would be forgotten. The concubine lived in constant, intimate proximity with their abuser. They knew this person. They learned their moods, their preferences, their quirks. The master might talk to the concubine, share thoughts, expect conversation and companionship alongside sexual service. This created a form of emotional intimacy that made the exploitation more complex and psychologically confusing. How do you maintain any sense of self when you're expected to be both intimate companion and sexual servant to someone who owns you? Evenings might involve attendance at symposia, if the master brought his concubine to such gatherings. The concubine would serve wine, provide entertainment, and yes, provide sexual services either to the master or to his guests as the master saw fit. Being passed around among drunk aristocrats at a symposium, being used by multiple men while their friends watched and joked, added another layer of degradation. Nights brought perhaps the most difficult aspect of concubinage. The master might want the concubine in his bed not just for sex but for sleep. This forced intimacy, lying beside someone who owned you, who had complete power over you, who could do anything to you, was psychologically devastating in ways that are hard to fully describe. There was no moment of true privacy, no space that was solely yours, no time when you could simply exist without reference to your owner's needs and desires. Every aspect of daily life was shaped by your status as sexual property. Both prostitutes and concubines lived with the knowledge that their situation could change at any moment. A prostitute might be sold to a new owner, moved to a different city, put into harsher conditions. A concubine might fall out of favour, might be sold or relegated to common slavery if they no longer pleased their master. They lived with the constant awareness that they had no rights, no legal protection, no recourse if they were abused. They could be punished for any perceived disobedience or failure to please. Punishments might include beatings, being denied food, being put in chains, or being sold to worse conditions as punishment. Daily life was defined by its monotony and its unpredictability. The same degrading routine repeated endlessly, but within that routine, any moment could bring violence or new humiliation. It was existence lived in a state of constant tension, always vigilant, always alert to danger, never truly able to relax. The economics of the body. Sexual slavery in ancient Greece wasn't just about power and desire. It was also fundamentally about money. Bodies were commodities, bought and sold, rented and exploited for profit. Understanding the economics of this system helps us see how deeply embedded it was in Greek society and how many people benefited from the degradation of others. The pricing of human beings for sexual purposes was ruthlessly pragmatic. A young, beautiful male slave suitable for sexual use might cost anywhere from 150 to 300 drachmas, or even more for exceptional beauty or special training. To put this in perspective, a common labourer might earn 1 drachma per day, so we're talking about 5 months to a year of wages for a typical worker. This represented a significant investment for a pornoboskos setting up a brothel, or for a wealthy citizen purchasing a personal concubine. The buyer would want to recoup that investment and profit from it, which meant putting the purchased slave to work immediately and extracting maximum value. For brothel prostitutes, the economics were brutally simple. The pornoboskos charged customers typically 1 to 3 obols per encounter, depending on the prostitute's age and appearance. An obol was 1/6 of a drachma, so even at 3 obols, you'd need 12 customers just to equal 2 drachmas. To recoup the purchase price of a slave who cost 200 drachmas, you'd need that slave to service 2,400 customers at 1 obol each, or 800 customers at 3 obols each. Of course, the mathematics wasn't that simple because the owner also had costs: feeding and housing the slaves, maintaining the building, paying any taxes on the business. But the point is clear: profit came from volume. The more customers a prostitute could service, the more profit the owner made. This economic imperative drove the brutal conditions of brothel prostitution. prostitutes were pushed to take as many customers as possible each day. They were given minimal food and rest because those things cost money and time that could be spent servicing customers. Their health was maintained only to the extent necessary to keep them functional. If a prostitute became ill or injured and couldn't work, they represented pure loss to the owner. There was no incentive to treat sick slaves beyond the minimum necessary to get them back to work. If they couldn't recover quickly, it might be more economically rational to simply abandon them and purchase a new slave. The pricing structure itself reveals the hierarchy within sexual slavery. Young prostitutes in their mid-teens could command 3 obols or sometimes more. As they aged, the price dropped. By their early 20s, they might only command 2 obols. By their late 20s, 1 obol or less. This age-based pricing reflected customer preferences, but also created a vicious cycle where younger slaves were worked most intensely, while they commanded premium prices, which meant they aged and were damaged more quickly. Some brothel owners specialized in particular types of prostitutes. There were brothels that offered only young boys, others that had a range of ages, others that advertised foreign slaves with exotic appearances. This specialization allowed owners to charge different prices and serve different market segments. The state also extracted profit from sexual slavery. Athens, like many Greek city-states, taxed prostitution. Both male and female prostitutes and their owners had to pay taxes on their earnings. This tax revenue helped fund public works, temples, and civic buildings. The Parthenon, that magnificent symbol of Greek civilization, was funded in part by taxes on sexual slavery. This state involvement reveals how accepted and normalized sexual slavery was. It wasn't a hidden shame. It was a recognized business sector, regulated and taxed like any other. The state had a financial interest in maintaining the system. For household concubines, the economics were different but still present. A wealthy citizen who purchased a beautiful youth for personal use wasn't primarily thinking about direct financial return. The value was in the pleasure, the status, the ability to display wealth and refined taste by owning an attractive companion. But there was still economic calculation. The concubine might be lent to friends, either as a favor or for payment. The master might bring the concubine to symposia, where others could appreciate and envy the master's possession. The concubine added to the master's social capital, which in a culture where relationships and reputation mattered enormously, had real economic value. Some owners bred slaves, including attractive male slaves, and sold the children. If a male slave was particularly beautiful and produced beautiful children, this could be a source of ongoing profit. The children would be raised as slaves and could be sold when they reached an age where they had value. The market for slaves, including sex slaves, was well developed and sophisticated. Major slave markets existed in cities like Athens, Corinth, and Aegina. Traders specialized in human cargo, traveling to areas where slaves could be acquired cheaply through war or piracy, and bringing them to cities where they could be sold at profit. These traders knew how to present their merchandise. Slaves would be cleaned, oiled, sometimes trained in basic skills that would increase their value. A male youth might be taught to dance or play an instrument, making him more valuable as a symposium entertainer. The presentation mattered because it affected price. Auctions were public events. Potential buyers would examine the slaves closely, checking for physical defects, estimating remaining years of prime attractiveness and usefulness. It was cold, calculated assessment of human beings as investment opportunities. For the slaves themselves, Understanding this economic reality was part of the psychological burden. You knew your price. You knew what you'd been valued at. You knew that you'd been purchased as an investment and that your owner expected return on that investment. Your pain, your degradation, your constant use, all of this was justified in economic terms that had nothing to do with you as a person. Some slaves understood the economics well enough to try to turn it to their advantage. If they could please customers particularly well, if they could develop regular clientele, they might earn tips beyond the basic price. In rare cases, a prostitute might accumulate enough money to purchase their own freedom, though owners had no obligation to allow this and often didn't. The economic structure also created hierarchies and jealousies among slaves. A beautiful young prostitute who commanded high prices might receive slightly better treatment from an owner who wanted to preserve their investment. This could create resentment from other slaves who were worked as hard but valued less. The economics of sexual slavery also intersected with other economic systems. Brothels might extend credit to regular customers. A man might rack up debt at a brothel and have to work off that debt. Prostitutes might be used as collateral for loans. If an owner needed money, they might use their slaves as security for borrowing. There were also informal economic arrangements. A prostitute might have a regular customer who paid extra for exclusive access during certain times. This arrangement benefited the owner through higher payment, but might also benefit the prostitute by meaning fewer total partners and potentially less violent encounters. The lifespan of economic usefulness was brutally short. A male prostitute might have peak earning years from roughly 14 or 15 to their early 20s, perhaps 10 years at most. During that decade, the owner would try to extract maximum value. After that, the slave's economic value plummeted. They might be kept in service but at lower prices, or they might be sold to less profitable work, or simply abandoned if they had no remaining value. This economic pressure created incentives for cruelty. The owner's interest was in short-term profit maximization, not in the long-term welfare of slaves who would age out of peak value anyway. Working a prostitute to the point of physical breakdown made economic sense if you could extract more profit in the short term than you'd lose when they became unable to work. The economics of sexual slavery also reveals something about the demand side. The fact that this system existed and thrived tells us that there were enough customers willing to pay for sexual access to enslaved youths and men to make the business profitable. These weren't marginal figures. These were ordinary citizens, sailors, merchants, artisans, aristocrats, the full range of Greek male society participating in a system of commodified sexual exploitation. The final economic reality was that for those trapped in sexual slavery, economic freedom was almost impossible. Even if you somehow accumulated money, even if you purchased your freedom, you carried the stigma of having been a pornos. You couldn't regain civic status if you'd ever had it. You couldn't fully participate in society. Your economic options remained limited. The system was designed to perpetuate itself. The power dynamics and agency. When we talk about sexual slavery in ancient Greece, we're talking about relationships defined by profound power imbalances. The slave or prostitute had almost no power. The owner or customer had nearly total power. But within this extreme imbalance, there were subtle dynamics, small spaces where limited agency might exist, and psychological mechanisms that helped people survive in circumstances that seem unendurable. The fundamental power relationship was clear and absolute. The slave was property. The owner could do anything they wished with their property short of destroying it so completely it lost all value. For sexual slaves, this meant the owner could use them sexually whenever and however they wanted, could lend or rent them to others, could punish them, could sell them, could kill them if they chose, though killing a slave might carry some economic penalty since you'd destroyed your own property. The customer who visited a brothel had nearly equal power during the transaction. Once they paid, the prostitute's body was theirs to use for the agreed time. If the prostitute tried to refuse, tried to set limits, they would be punished by the brothel owner. The customer's satisfaction was paramount. The prostitute's comfort, preference, or pain was irrelevant. This total power imbalance shaped every aspect of the relationship. The prostitute or concubine had to be constantly alert to the desires and moods of those who controlled them. Survival often depended on reading signals correctly, on anticipating what was wanted before it was demanded, on making the experience satisfying enough that violence might be avoided or minimized. This hypervigilance is a well-documented psychological response to powerlessness. When you can't control what happens to you, you become intensely focused on predicting it, on finding any small way to influence outcomes. A prostitute might learn that a particular regular customer was more gentle if you made eye contact and smiled. Another customer might prefer you to seem frightened. Another wanted you completely passive and unresponsive. Learning these preferences and adapting to them was a form of agency, however limited. Some slaves and prostitutes developed what we might recognize as survival strategies. The ability to dissociate, to separate your consciousness from what was happening to your body was crucial. Many described feeling as if they were watching from outside themselves, as if the body being used wasn't really theirs. This dissociation allowed them to endure what might otherwise break them psychologically. Others developed personas, alternate identities they inhabited while working. The real self retreated to some protected inner space, while a constructed self went through the motions of sexual service. This bifurcation of identity helped maintain some sense of a core self that wasn't defined solely by degradation. There were also small acts of resistance, tiny assertions of agency that probably felt significant to those who performed them. A prostitute might deliberately fail to seem enthusiastic, might give the minimum required but no more. A concubine might find subtle ways to make their owner's life slightly more difficult. Small acts of sabotage or passive resistance that couldn't be clearly punished, but that provided some sense of self-assertion. These acts weren't heroic resistance. They were barely resistance at all. But in circumstances of nearly total powerlessness, even the smallest assertion of will had psychological importance. Some individuals formed alliances with those who had power over them. A concubine might cultivate genuine fondness from their owner, might become truly valued not just as a sexual object, but as a companion. This created a complicated psychological dynamic. On one hand, being valued could mean better treatment, more security. On the other hand, it could make the exploitation more psychologically confusing, harder to maintain any clear sense of self apart from the relationship with the abuser. There's a psychological term for this: trauma bonding. When you're completely dependent on someone who also harms you, your psyche can create attachment to them as a survival mechanism. You convince yourself that you care for them, that the relationship is mutual in some way, because that's less psychologically devastating than acknowledging that you're utterly powerless and that the person you depend on cares nothing for you as a human being. For sexual slaves and prostitutes, trauma bonding might manifest as feeling special when the owner treated them well, as taking pride in satisfying customers, as developing genuine seeming emotional attachment to their abusers. This wasn't healthy adaptation. It was a psychological response to an impossible situation. Power dynamics also existed among the slaves themselves. In a brothel, there might be informal hierarchies based on age, beauty, how long someone had been there, how much money they generated. These hierarchies created some slaves who had slightly more social power within that constrained world, who might be given small privileges or who might help manage newer or younger slaves. But these hierarchies were ultimately meaningless because they existed within a framework of total powerlessness. It was like being king of the dungeon. You might have slightly more status than other prisoners, but you were still a prisoner. The question of consent in these circumstances is complex and important. In modern understanding, we recognize that consent requires the genuine option to refuse. If you can't refuse without suffering serious consequences, consent doesn't exist. By this standard, none of the sexual activity involving slaves or prostitutes in ancient Greece involved genuine consent. All of it was coerced either by direct force or by the structural violence of slavery itself. But the Greeks didn't think in these terms. They didn't have our concept of consent. Sexual access to slaves and prostitutes was understood as a purchased right. The transaction was consensual in their view because money had been exchanged or because the relationship of ownership existed. What the slave or prostitute wanted was simply not relevant to the question. This fundamental difference in understanding consent matters for how we think about these relationships. We can recognize that from a modern ethical standpoint, all of this sexual activity was rape, was sexual slavery, was exploitation. But we also need to understand that the Greeks didn't see it that way, which tells us something disturbing about how much moral understanding can vary across cultures. The power dynamics also extended beyond the direct relationship between slave and owner or customer. The entire social structure reinforced the powerlessness of sexual slaves. Laws didn't protect them. Public opinion didn't sympathize with them. They had no advocates, no voice, no way to appeal to any higher authority. If a slave tried to escape, if they were caught, they would be punished severely. Branding, whipping, being sold to even worse conditions, these were all possible consequences. The risk of attempted escape usually outweighed any realistic chance of success and freedom. Some slaves did escape, fled to temples which offered some protection or tried to reach other cities. But successfully escaping and building any kind of life was nearly impossible. Your appearance might be described in missing slave notices. Your inability to prove free status would mark you as likely enslaved. Without citizenship, without family, without resources, a fugitive slave faced death or recapture. The psychological impact of such total powerlessness is hard for us to fully grasp. Imagine living every day knowing that you have no rights, that you can be used in any way someone wants, that your pain means nothing, that your only value is in your ability to provide sexual satisfaction to others. Imagine knowing this will continue until you're too old or damaged to be useful, at which point you'll be discarded. Some people broke under this reality. Mental illness was common among slaves, particularly sexual slaves. Depression, what we might today recognize as PTSD, various forms of psychological breakdown, these were predictable responses to unpredictable but constant trauma. Others found ways to endure that protected some core sense of self, however fragile. They might cling to memories of life before enslavement, might maintain hope of somehow gaining freedom, might create small rituals or beliefs that gave meaning to their existence beyond just being used. Religion could play a role here. Believing in divine justice, in an afterlife where wrongs would be righted, could help someone endure present suffering. Some slaves became devoted to particular gods or goddesses they felt offered them protection, or witnessed their suffering even if they couldn't prevent it. The power dynamics of sexual slavery in ancient Greece remind us that power isn't just about the ability to force compliance, it's also about the ability to define reality, to determine what counts as acceptable behavior, to establish who matters as a person and who doesn't. The Greeks had power not just over the bodies of slaves, but over the entire conceptual framework that made sexual slavery seem normal, natural, and acceptable. The legal status and social stigma. The legal status of male prostitutes and concubines in ancient Greece was one of profound vulnerability. Laws existed, but they protected owners and free citizens far more than they protected those who were enslaved or engaged in sexual labor. Understanding the legal framework reveals how thoroughly the system was designed to perpetuate itself and protect those who benefited from it. In Athens, which provides most of our legal evidence, slaves had minimal legal standing. They were property under the law. They couldn't own property themselves, couldn't enter into contracts, couldn't testify in court except under torture, which was the only form of slave testimony considered reliable. This legal status meant that crimes committed against slaves were treated as property crimes against the owner, not as crimes against the slave themselves. If someone injured or killed another person's slave, the penalty was compensation to the owner for lost property value, not punishment for harming a human being. For sexual slaves, this meant they had no legal recourse against abuse. If a customer became violent during a brothel visit and injured a prostitute, the owner might demand compensation, but the prostitute themselves had no standing to complain. The harm to them as a person was legally irrelevant. The law did regulate prostitution itself. Brothels were legal and taxed. The pornoboskoi were legitimate business people, though not necessarily respectable ones. Athenian law codes included provisions about regulating prostitution prices during certain festivals and about maintaining public order in districts where brothels were concentrated. But these regulations were about maintaining civic order and generating tax revenue. They weren't about protecting prostitutes. A law limiting what brothels could charge for services protected customers from being overcharged, not prostitutes from being exploited. One significant area where Athenian law did address male prostitution was in regulations affecting free male citizens. A citizen who prostituted himself, who sold sexual access to his own body, lost significant civic rights permanently. He could no longer speak in the assembly, couldn't hold magistracies, couldn't serve as a public priest, couldn't speak as a prosecutor in certain types of trials. This legal penalty reveals how threatening male prostitution was to Athenian self-understanding. The citizen body was supposed to be inviolable, masculine, dominant. A citizen who allowed himself to be penetrated for money had fundamentally compromised his status. The legal penalties formalized this degradation. These laws applied only to citizens, though. A slave who prostituted himself or a foreign resident who did so faced no legal penalties because they already lacked the civic rights these laws would remove. The legal stigma attached specifically to free male citizens lowering themselves to prostitution. This legal framework created a multi-tiered system. At the top were free male citizens who used prostitutes but maintained their full legal and social status. Below them were free male citizens who had prostituted themselves and lost civic rights. Below them were metics, foreign residents, who had limited rights to begin with. and at the very bottom were slaves, who had essentially no legal personhood. Court cases sometimes touched on prostitution. In Aeschines' prosecution of Timarchus, the entire case revolved around allegations that Timarchus had prostituted himself as a youth. Aeschines argued this disqualified Timarchus from public office. The speech survives, giving us detailed if biased information about how such accusations were argued and what evidence might be presented. What's striking in this and similar cases is how the legal argument focused entirely on the defendant's status and rights. Whether the defendant had been harmed, whether they had been coerced, whether they had suffered, none of this mattered. What mattered was whether they had committed acts that disqualified them from citizenship privileges. The law also addressed pederastic relationships, though indirectly. There were regulations about protecting citizen youths from inappropriate sexual attention. Teachers were forbidden from opening their schools before dawn or keeping them open after dark, times when improper solicitation might occur. These laws tried to protect citizen youth from being drawn into prostitution or inappropriate pederastic relationships, but again, the protection was for the preservation of future citizen status, not for the welfare of the youths themselves. The concern was maintaining the purity of the citizen body, ensuring that citizen boys grew into proper masculine citizens, rather than being degraded by premature or inappropriate sexual activity. For concubines living in private households, legal status was murky. They were slaves, so they had no independent legal standing. But their specific role as sexual partners to their owners created complications. If an owner died, what happened to a concubine? They might be inherited by the owner's heir, might be freed in the will, might be sold. The law didn't clearly address their specific status. In Sparta, the situation was different. Sparta had its helot system, agricultural serfs who were conquered populations kept in perpetual servitude. While helots weren't typically used as sexual slaves in the same way as chattel slaves in Athens, young helots could be subjected to sexual exploitation by Spartan citizens. The legal framework offered helots no protection. They could be killed by Spartans without legal consequence, let alone protected from sexual abuse. The legal status of sexual slaves and prostitutes also affected what happened to children born from sexual slavery. If a female slave bore a child, that child inherited slave status. If a male prostitute or concubine fathered a child somehow, that child would typically be enslaved if the mother was enslaved. There was no legal recognition of paternity for slaves in a way that would give children any claim to free status through their enslaved father. Social stigma operated alongside legal status to maintain the system. Even freed slaves who had been prostitutes carried permanent taint. They could never fully join respectable society. Their past would be known or suspected. They would be referred to with terms that marked their former status. For males who had been prostitutes, the stigma was particularly intense. Masculinity in Greek culture was tied to dominance, to being the penetrator, never the penetrated. A man who had been sexually used, even if enslaved and coerced, was permanently marked as feminine, as degraded as less than a full man. This social stigma wasn't just about judgment or prejudice. It had practical consequences. A freed former prostitute would have difficulty finding other work. They couldn't marry into respectable families. Their children would carry some of the stigma. They existed in society but apart from it, marked forever by what had been done to them and what they'd been forced to do. The combination of legal vulnerability and social stigma created an almost perfect trap. The law didn't protect you while you were enslaved in sexual labor. Society judged and marked you if you somehow escaped. There was no path to normal life, to respectability, to full participation in society. This legal and social framework supported the economic system. If freed former prostitutes could easily reintegrate into society, if they could find good work and respect, it might reduce the supply of people desperate enough to enter prostitution. But because freedom brought no real improvement in status, because the stigma was permanent, the system replenished itself with those who had no better options. The laws also protected customers. There was no legal penalty for using prostitutes, no social stigma attached to men who visited brothels or kept concubines. This was normal, acceptable male behavior. The law made sure customers could engage in sexual exploitation without risk to their own status or reputation. Legal cases sometimes reveal the cruelty of this system. In the speech against Niera, a woman who had been a prostitute is prosecuted for illegally claiming citizen status through marriage. The speaker details her history in prostitution, uses it to attack her character, argues that someone who had sold their body should never be allowed to contaminate the citizen body through marriage. The cruelty is that her past sexual exploitation, forced upon her in childhood, is used as permanent evidence of her degradation and unworthiness. The legal system thus wasn't neutral. It actively reinforced sexual slavery. It protected owners and customers. It stigmatized and marked those who were victimized. It made escape impossible even if you somehow gained freedom. It ensured that the entire weight of social and legal structure pressed down on those at the bottom, keeping them there. Famous cases and historical examples. While most individuals who experienced sexual slavery in ancient Greece remain anonymous to history, their lives unrecorded except as statistics and generalizations, a few specific cases survived in ancient sources. These examples, while exceptional by the very fact that they were recorded, offer glimpses into specific lives and specific circumstances. Perhaps the most famous example is Phaedo of Elis. Phaedo came from a noble family in Elis, a Greek city-state. When Elis was conquered by the Spartans, Phaedo was enslaved along with others from his city. He was young and reportedly very beautiful. He was taken to Athens and sold to a brothel, where he was forced to work as a prostitute. This trajectory, from free citizen to enslaved prostitute, was not uncommon during times of war. What made Phaedo's case exceptional was that he was noticed by someone influential. According to tradition, either Socrates or Plato noticed Phaedo working in the brothel and was struck by his intelligence and potential. They arranged for his freedom to be purchased. Once freed, Phaedo became a philosopher, a member of Socrates' circle. He founded a school of philosophy in Elis. Plato named one of his most important dialogues after Phaedo, the dialogue where Socrates discusses the immortality of the soul before his execution. Phaedo thus transformed from enslaved prostitute to respected philosopher, a trajectory so unusual that his case was remembered and recorded. But we should note what this story reveals. Phaedo's rescue depended entirely on being noticed by someone powerful who took personal interest in him. Thousands of other youths in his position, equally intelligent, equally deserving, languished and died in sexual slavery because they weren't lucky enough to catch the eye of a philosopher. The story also reveals the casual acceptance of sexual slavery. Socrates and Plato apparently thought nothing of encountering an enslaved youth in a brothel. This was so normal that it wasn't worth commenting on. What was worth commenting on was that they recognized this particular youth's potential and did something about it. The system itself wasn't questioned. Another figure who appears in ancient sources is Timarchus, though his case is controversial. Aeschines accused Timarchus of having prostituted himself as a youth, which would disqualify him from holding public office. Aeschines' speech against Timarchus survives as a detailed attack on Timarchus's character and sexual history. According to Aeschines, Timarchus as a young man had lived with various older men in arrangements that amounted to prostitution, accepting money and gifts for sexual access. Timarchus responded to these accusations, but his speech doesn't survive. We don't know if the accusations were true or if this was character assassination by a political enemy. What's significant is how the case reveals the line between acceptable pederastic relationships and condemned prostitution. Aeschines had to argue that Timarchus's relationships weren't noble pederastic mentorship but crass prostitution. The distinction mattered legally and socially, but the actual experiences might have been quite similar. The difference was largely in framing and in whether money was explicitly exchanged. Ancient comedy provides glimpses of male prostitutes and concubines, though filtered through humour and exaggeration. Comic playwrights like Aristophanes made frequent references to pornoi, to pederastic relationships, to the sexual economy of Athens. These references were usually jokes at someone's expense, but they confirm that sexual slavery was visible and familiar enough to provide material for comedy. In Aristophanes' plays, there are references to men who keep beautiful slave boys, to brothels in specific districts, to the price of sexual services, to the disgrace of citizens who prostituted themselves. These throwaway lines in comedies probably wouldn't make sense to audiences if they didn't refer to well-known realities. Historical figures like Alcibiades were known for their complicated sexual relationships. Alcibiades famously pursued Socrates sexually, while also being pursued by numerous other men. His relationship with Socrates, as portrayed in Plato's Symposium, shows some of the complexity of male-male desire in Athens. Alcibiades describes attempting to seduce Socrates, being frustrated by Socrates' resistance. But Alcibiades was a free citizen, a powerful and wealthy man. His experiences bear little resemblance to those of enslaved prostitutes. Yet the same culture that celebrated Alcibiades' beauty and sexual power made enslaved youths available for purchase and use. Ancient sources occasionally mention symposia entertainment that included enslaved boys. There are vase paintings showing symposia where nude or partially dressed young males serve wine and provide entertainment to reclining men. These images don't typically show explicit sexual activity, but the context makes clear that sexual services were part of the entertainment being provided. One vase painting, known as the Tomb of the Diver, includes symposium scenes with young males attending to older men in ways that strongly suggest pederastic or sexual context. These artistic representations provide visual evidence of how integrated sexual slavery was into elite male social life. Historical sources sometimes mention specific pornoboskoi, brothel owners, by name. These were known figures in their communities, business people whose occupation was public knowledge. That they're named in historical sources without apparent shame confirms that running brothels and profiting from sexual slavery was acceptable business. There are also references to famous hetairai, female courtesans, who achieved wealth and influence. Some of these women, like Aspasia, who was partner to Pericles, became significant figures in their own right. But there are no equivalent stories of male prostitutes or concubines achieving such status. The gendered dynamics of sexual slavery meant that opportunities for upward mobility, rare as they were for women, were virtually non-existent for males in equivalent positions. Legal speeches survive that mention male prostitution in passing. These references are usually hostile, using someone's past in prostitution to attack their character or credibility. But the frequency of such references suggests how common the practice was. If it was rare, it wouldn't be effective as a rhetorical attack because audiences wouldn't relate to it. The Against Neaera speech, while primarily about a female prostitute, mentions male prostitutes in passing as comparisons. The speaker assumes his audience is familiar with both male and female prostitution, with how brothels operate, with the economic and social dynamics involved. What's notable about all these historical examples is what they reveal and what they obscure. We have names and stories for a tiny number of individuals who were exceptional enough that their cases were recorded. But for every Phaedo who escaped through philosophical connection, there were thousands who lived and died in sexual slavery without anyone recording their names or their experiences. The historical record also tends to focus on Athens because that's where most surviving sources come from. But sexual slavery existed throughout the Greek world. In Corinth, known for its large numbers of prostitutes, in Sparta with its different social system but similar sexual exploitation, in colonies and settlements across the Mediterranean. The specific details might vary, but the fundamental realities were similar. These famous cases and historical examples give us entry points into understanding the system. They make it concrete, turn statistics and generalizations into specific lives. But we have to remember that they're not representative. Most people in sexual slavery were never exceptional enough to be recorded. They were anonymous slaves whose experiences are lost to history, except insofar as we can reconstruct them from broader evidence about how the system operated. The examples that survived did so often because they illustrated something exceptional, or because they served some rhetorical purpose for the person writing about them. Phaedo's story survived because it demonstrated philosophy's power to recognize worth even in degraded circumstances. Timarchus's case survived because it was useful for arguing about citizenship and sexual propriety. Comedy's references survived as entertainment. None of these sources prioritized the actual experience of sexual slavery from the perspective of those who endured it. We have no memoirs from male prostitutes, no first-person accounts of what it felt like. We have only external observations, often hostile or dismissive, from free men who used such individuals or from writers who mentioned them in passing while discussing other topics. This silence in the historical record is itself significant. It reflects how little value ancient sources placed on the experiences and perspectives of enslaved people generally and sexual slaves specifically. Their lives mattered only as they intersected with the lives of free citizens who might be affected by them or who might want to use them. The psychological burden, beyond the physical suffering, beyond the economic exploitation, beyond the legal vulnerability, male prostitutes and concubines in ancient Greece carried enormous psychological burdens. The mental and emotional toll of sexual slavery is difficult for us to fully comprehend, but we can try to understand it through what we know about trauma, about identity formation, about what happens to people who are treated not as human beings, but as objects. The most fundamental psychological burden was the destruction of autonomy. Human beings need some sense of control over their own lives, some ability to make meaningful choices, some experience of agency. Sexual slavery stripped away nearly all agency. You didn't choose when you woke or slept, what you ate, how you spent your time, what happened to your body. This loss of autonomy has profound psychological effects. Research on trauma shows that lack of control is often more damaging psychologically than physical pain itself. When you have no control, when nothing you do can meaningfully affect your circumstances, learned helplessness develops. You stop trying to resist or improve things because experience has taught you that resistance is futile and often makes things worse. For male prostitutes and concubines, this learned helplessness might manifest as complete passivity, going through the motions of survival without hope or expectation of change. This passivity was actually adaptive in the short term. It reduced conflict and punishment. But it was psychologically devastating in the long term, creating a sense of being fundamentally powerless in the world. Another major psychological burden was the constant threat of violence. Even when violence wasn't actively happening, it was always possible. A customer might become violent. The owner might decide to punish you. Another slave might attack you out of jealousy or desperation. You lived in constant hypervigilance, always alert to danger, never able to truly relax. This constant state of alert creates what we now recognize as symptoms of PTSD, sleep problems, because you can't fully relax enough to sleep deeply, startle responses, jumping at sudden movements or sounds, difficulty concentrating because your mind is always partly focused on monitoring for threats, emotional numbing because staying constantly afraid is unsustainable, so you shut down emotionally to cope. The trauma of sexual slavery was also cumulative. It wasn't one terrible event that you might eventually process and recover from. It was ongoing, repeated, unending trauma. Day after day your body was violated. Day after day you were treated as an object. The trauma piled up, layer upon layer, until your entire sense of self was built around it. For many, dissociation became a primary coping mechanism. You learned to separate your consciousness from your body during sexual encounters. You might feel as if you were floating above the scene, watching it happen to someone else. You might create an internal space where the real you retreated while a shell of yourself went through the motions. This dissociation was protective at the moment but had long-term costs. Over time, you might lose the ability to be fully present even when you weren't being actively abused. You might feel disconnected from your own body, from your own emotions, from your own life. You existed, but in a ghostly, not fully there way. Identity itself became problematic. Who were you? If you'd been enslaved as a youth, you might have memories of a previous identity, of being a son, a student, a free person with a name and family and future. But that person no longer existed. You'd been transformed into property, into pornos, into a thing whose only purpose was sexual service. How do you maintain any sense of continuous self when the person you were has been so violently destroyed and replaced? Some people clung desperately to memories of their previous life, treating those memories as proof that they were once human, once valued, once free. Others might try to forget, finding it too painful to remember what they'd lost. For those born into sexual slavery, identity formation was even more complicated. You'd never been anything other than this. Your earliest memories were of being property, of sexual use, of degradation. How do you develop a sense of self, of worth, of basic humanity when you've never been treated as human? Some might create an identity around being good at the work, being skilled at satisfying customers, being the favorite of the owner. This gave some sense of accomplishment and value, but it was value defined entirely by how well you served others sexually. It was identity built on your own exploitation. The psychological burden also included shame, profound and internalized shame about what was happening to you and what you were forced to do. Even though the abuse wasn't your fault, even though you had no choice, shame is a natural human response to sexual violation and to degradation. This shame might manifest in many ways. Feeling that you were dirty, polluted, fundamentally damaged. Feeling that you deserved what was happening to you. Feeling that you had no right to want better or to imagine yourself as worthy of respect. This internalized shame could be more damaging than the abuse itself, turning you against yourself, making you complicit in your own degradation. For male prostitutes and concubines, shame might be particularly intense because of cultural ideas about masculinity. You were being penetrated, taking what Greek culture defined as the female role in sex. This meant you weren't really a man, weren't properly masculine. This gender shame added another layer to the general shame of sexual slavery. The psychological burden also included grief for a life you would never have. If you'd been free or if you'd been enslaved for other work, you might have imagined a future. Family, perhaps, a trade or skill, some form of ordinary life, but sexual slavery destroyed those possibilities. You would never be normal. You would never be clean. You would never be able to imagine yourself into the kind of future that ordinary people expected. This anticipatory grief, mourning a life that would never be, could be devastating. It wasn't just that you were suffering now. It was that you knew this suffering was your entire life, that it would continue until you were discarded or died, that there was no hope of something better. Relationships with other enslaved people were complicated psychologically. There might be solidarity and compassion, people who understood your suffering because they shared it. But there might also be competition, cruelty, hierarchies that made things worse. And any relationships you formed were precarious. People could be sold away, could die, could be separated from you at any moment. This inability to form stable attachments, to trust that people would remain in your life, created its own psychological damage. Humans need connections, need relationships, need to matter to others and have others matter to them. But forming those bonds in circumstances where they could be destroyed at any moment was terrifying. Some people closed themselves off entirely, refusing to care because caring meant pain when separation inevitably came. The psychological burden also included the challenge of survival itself. You had to find ways to keep going, keep functioning, keep enduring. This required enormous psychological resources. You had to develop mental strategies for managing trauma, for maintaining some sense of self, for not simply giving up and dying. Some people found these resources in religion, believing in divine justice or an afterlife where suffering would be redeemed. Others found them in small acts of resistance or in maintaining inner dignity, even while being outwardly degraded. Others found them simply in the day-to-day absorption in survival, focusing on getting through each day without thinking about tomorrow. For those few who eventually gained freedom, the psychological burden didn't end. The trauma, the shame, the damaged sense of self, these things persisted. You might be legally free but internally still enslaved, still defined by what had been done to you, still carrying the weight of all those years. Flashbacks might occur unexpectedly. Something would trigger a memory and suddenly you were back in the brothel, back in the body being violated, experiencing the fear and pain as if it were happening now. This made normal life nearly impossible because you never knew what would trigger these intrusive memories. Trust was shattered. How could you trust anyone when your experience had taught you that people would use you, hurt you, see you as an object? How could you believe anyone cared about you as a person, when your entire lived experience contradicted that possibility. The psychological burden of sexual slavery in ancient Greece was thus not just about the suffering during enslavement. It was a lifelong weight, a fundamental shaping of the psyche around trauma and degradation that could never be fully healed even if circumstances changed. It was the cost in human psychological well-being of a system that treated some people as sexual property for the pleasure and profit of others. Legacy and modern understanding, the sexual slavery that existed in ancient Greece didn't disappear when Greece fell to Rome or when Christianity spread through the ancient world. The practices continued in various forms throughout history and echo into our present. Understanding this legacy and how we approach these historical realities today is crucial for several reasons. First, we need to acknowledge that sexual slavery existed in nearly all ancient cultures. Greece wasn't unique in this. Rome, Persia, Egypt, China, civilizations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas all had forms of sexual slavery. The specific details varied. Different legal structures, different social norms, different economic systems, but the fundamental reality of some people being used sexually by others through coercion and force was nearly universal. This universality tells us something important. It tells us that under certain social and economic conditions, humans have repeatedly created systems of sexual exploitation. It's not about one culture being uniquely evil. It's about how power, economics, and cultural norms can combine to normalize practices that we now recognize as profoundly wrong. When Rome conquered Greece, they absorbed many Greek cultural practices, including attitudes about sexual slavery. Roman men kept male concubines, called concubini. They visited male prostitutes. They developed their own complex terminology and social rules around same-sex sexual exploitation. The Roman practice of pederasty was influenced by Greek models but had its own characteristics. Roman law formalized sexual slavery in some ways that Greek law hadn't. The legal status of slaves was codified in detail. The rights of owners over enslaved people's bodies were spelled out explicitly. The system became more bureaucratic, more regularized, more thoroughly embedded in legal structure. Christianity's emergence and spread eventually challenged sexual slavery, though not as quickly or completely as we might expect. Early Christian theology emphasized the spiritual equality of all people before God, which theoretically contradicted slavery. But early Christians didn't generally call for the abolition of slavery. Instead, they advocated for treating slaves better while accepting the institution itself. Sexual slavery specifically was condemned more directly. Christian sexual ethics emphasized celibacy or monogamous marriage. The use of slaves or prostitutes for sexual gratification was considered sinful. Over centuries, as Christianity became dominant in the former Roman Empire, sexual slavery did decline, though it never entirely disappeared. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Rome in the East, maintained systems of slavery including sexual slavery. The Islamic world that emerged in the 7th century also developed systems of sexual slavery with its own characteristics. Male concubines appeared in Islamic cultures, particularly in contexts like harems where enslaved males served as eunuch guardians or as sexual partners to wealthy men. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, sexual exploitation continued in various forms. While chattel slavery declined, other forms of unfree labour persisted. Sexual exploitation of servants, of those in dependent positions, of those without power, this continued as a reality even as the specific legal framework of ancient slavery disappeared. The Atlantic slave trade and subsequent plantation slavery in the Americas brought back large-scale chattel slavery, including sexual slavery. Both female and male slaves were sexually exploited by owners. The dynamics were somewhat different than in ancient Greece. The racial component added dimensions that hadn't existed in the ancient world, but the fundamental reality of sexual slavery persisted. In the modern world, sexual slavery continues in the form of human trafficking, forced prostitution, and sexual exploitation of those without legal status or social power. The United Nations estimates millions of people are currently trapped in various forms of modern slavery, including sexual slavery. The methods and contexts change, but the underlying dynamic, exploiting powerlessness to use people's bodies sexually, remains. Understanding the history of sexual slavery in ancient Greece is thus not just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing patterns of exploitation that have persisted throughout history and that continue today. It's about seeing how societies normalize practices that cause immense suffering when those practices benefit people with power. How we study and talk about sexual slavery in ancient Greece also matters. For a long time, classical studies avoided these topics or discussed them euphemistically. Male-male sexual relationships in ancient Greece were often romanticized, presented as noble pederasty and philosophical eros, while ignoring the slavery and exploitation. More recent scholarship has been more honest about these realities. Historians now explicitly discuss sexual slavery, acknowledge the lack of consent, analyze the power dynamics, and center the experience of those who were exploited rather than just analyzing the cultural meanings for those who did the exploiting. This shift in how we approach the topic reflects broader changes in how we think about sexuality, consent, and power. We now recognize that consent requires genuine freedom to refuse. We understand trauma better. We're more willing to acknowledge that cultural practices we've inherited might have been profoundly unjust. But we have to be careful not to simply condemn the ancient Greeks as uniquely evil or to feel smugly superior to them. Every culture has practices that future generations will judge harshly. Our current society has its own systems of exploitation that we're often blind to precisely because we're embedded in them. The value in studying sexual slavery in ancient Greece is partly in understanding the past honestly, not romanticizing or sanitizing it. But it's also in recognizing the capacity humans have to normalize and participate in systems of exploitation, to create elaborate justifications for treating some people as less than human, to build entire economic and social systems on the suffering of others. The ancient Greeks created magnificent art and architecture. They developed philosophy, democracy, theatre, mathematics. They achieved things we still admire and study. And they also enslaved people and used them sexually. Both things are true. One doesn't excuse or cancel out the other. This complexity is important to hold. We can appreciate Greek achievements while acknowledging Greek cruelties. We can learn from Greek philosophy while recognizing that philosophers who wrote about justice often owned slaves. We can admire Greek democracy while noting that it coexisted with and depended upon slavery and exploitation. For individuals descended from people who were enslaved, this history resonates differently. It's not abstract historical analysis. It's about understanding systems of dehumanization and exploitation that affected ancestors, that created intergenerational trauma, that shaped the world we inherited. For scholars and students, this history challenges us to look at sources critically, to ask whose voices are preserved and whose are absent, to try to understand experiences even when they weren't recorded, to recognize that history is often written by those with power and thus naturally centers their perspectives and interests. The legacy of sexual slavery in ancient Greece also includes how it shaped later European and Western culture. Classical Greek culture was idealized during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. This idealization often involved romanticizing Greek attitudes toward male desire while ignoring the slavery and exploitation. This romanticization contributed to complicated and often harmful attitudes about sexuality, masculinity, and power that persisted into modern times. The idea that pederastic relationships were noble and educational influenced how some people thought about relationships between adults and youths, often to harmful effect. We're still working through this legacy, still trying to understand Greek culture in ways that are honest about both its achievements and its violence, still learning to appreciate what's valuable while rejecting what caused suffering. Looking forward, understanding this history can inform how we think about modern issues. Human trafficking today is different in its details from ancient slavery, but understanding the historical patterns, how exploitation is normalized, how economic incentives drive it, how power dynamics shape it. This understanding can help us address modern forms of exploitation more effectively. The history also reminds us that moral progress is possible. Practices that were once nearly universal and considered natural, like slavery including sexual slavery, are now widely condemned. This didn't happen automatically. It happened because people recognized the humanity of those being exploited, because moral understanding evolved, because activists and reformers fought against systems that benefited from exploitation. But history also reminds us that moral progress isn't inevitable or irreversible. Systems of exploitation can return in new forms. Dehumanization can happen again. Vigilance is necessary to prevent the repetition of historical patterns of abuse. For those of us studying and thinking about this history tonight, the question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we just intellectually note that bad things happened in the past? Or do we let it change how we think about power, consent, dignity, and justice? Do we let it make us more alert to exploitation happening now? Do we let it inspire commitment to ensuring such systems don't persist or return? The male prostitutes and concubines of ancient Greece are long dead. Their individual suffering is over, but their stories, fragmentary and largely anonymous as they are, bear witness to human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. They remind us what happens when some people are treated as property. They challenge us to build societies where everyone's humanity is recognized and protected. As we end this journey through an uncomfortable part of history, sit with what you've learned. Feel the weight of it. These were real people who lived real lives marked by suffering we can barely imagine. They deserve to be remembered honestly, not romanticized or forgotten. Their humanity matters, even across the gulf of centuries, especially across the gulf of centuries because time doesn't erase the moral weight of what was done to them. Sleep now if you can, and perhaps tomorrow look at the world around you with slightly different eyes. Look for the ways people are still exploited. Look for the systems that benefit some at the cost of others' dignity and freedom. Look for the normalized cruelties we might be blind to precisely because they're normalized. The history of sexual slavery in ancient Greece teaches us that ordinary people in ordinary societies can participate in extraordinary cruelty when that cruelty is culturally accepted and economically profitable. It teaches us to question what our own culture accepts. It teaches us that the work of recognizing and protecting human dignity is never finished, And it teaches us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when treated as things rather than people, humans endured. They found ways to survive. They maintained some sense of self against overwhelming forces trying to destroy it. That capacity for endurance, for maintaining humanity in the face of dehumanization, is perhaps the most important legacy of all. Good night.